Welcome to the Catholic Table Talk podcast. This is where everything Catholic is on the table. New episodes Thursdays at 9 a.m. Eastern on most podcast platforms. Here's your host, William Sauber.
And welcome back to the show, everyone. Thank you again for joining us at the table for another great episode here at Catholic Table Talk Podcast. If you have not checked out our website, I highly recommend that you do. I update it almost every day. It's CatholicTableTalk.com. You can find episodes, you can find posts, you can find the shop, the merchandise. You can find all that at CatholicTableTalk.com. Of course, find us on most podcast platforms as well as YouTube, X, Instagram, Facebook, etc. We try to post to most of them. So like, comment, subscribe, and leave us a review on wherever you listen to your podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Dr. George Saguma. Dr. George Saguma is a family physician who practices holistic health and healing. Please visit Dr. George for more info at drgeorge.com. Again, it's drgeorge.com. Thank you for Dr. George for sponsoring today's episode. Also, he sent me an email yesterday saying he's not in good health, so I also pray for Dr. George for his health as well. Good friend of the show, and wish him all the best. So today we have a very almost like a mix-up on the show. We usually talk about straightforward the Catholic faith, right? Well, today we have a little excitement today about sports. And if you're new to the show or you're not new to the show, if you know me or you don't know me, I am a pretty big Minnesota sports guy, right? I absolutely love the Vikings. I love the Twins. I love the Wild. The others I watch to a degree, but those are my top three. And it's really hard to, distinguish living sports besides maybe loving what we're supposed to love, which is God, right? Which is going to Mass on Sundays, and which is maybe going to Mass during the week, spending time in the sacraments. But sports, which in terms kind of brings families together, it can kind of have maybe a separating effect from us and our Creator, God. So we have a very special guest on, Bruce Wawrzyniak. He is the founder of Catholic Sports Radio, and down in beautiful Tampa, Florida. And so we're going a little bit about Bruce here. Just find there we go. He is a host and creator of Catholic Sports Radio, like I said. He was born and baptized Catholic. He has spent the majority of his professional career working in sports and is a veteran broadcaster and podcaster, which, if you listen to his podcast, is probably one of the best that I have heard out there. So he's very professional at what he does. His faith life includes being a Benedictine oblate to the St. Louis Abbey in West Central Florida, participating regularly in a monthly men's prayer group through his church, and being a president of a weekly Christian Business Connections group. So he's rich, he's deeply rooted in the faith, he's deeply rooted to the thing he loves, which is broadcasting and sports. And when I found him, I knew we shared the same kind of thoughts or the loves, so I knew I had to get him on the show. So with that being said, welcome to the show, Bruce Wawrzyniak. So Bruce, thank you for what you do. Again, it's a very great show that you have that I have listened to, and thank you for your time tonight to come on the show.
Thank you, William. Thank you for the kind words and for the opportunity to be on your show.
Absolutely. So I know I gave you a little intro about you and your show, Bruce, but just kind of give the audience a little bit more about kind of who you are, and most importantly, a lot about Catholic Sports Radio, which is a very, again, it's a fascinating name, it's a fascinating topic.
Thanks. You already addressed the faith side of it, so I want to give your audience a little background as to what qualifies me to come at it from the sports angle. And
Sure.
I worked for 10 seasons for a National Hockey League team. Then for 3 years, I was the vice president of public relations at the league office for the National Lacrosse League. I don't know if there's still a team in Minnesota. The
I
Minnesota
don't believe so.
Storm, I want to say they might have been called. I might have the wrong name. This was after I left the NLL. Then for
Okay.
10 and a half years, I was involved with the Olympic movement. As you mentioned in what you read off, I am still active broadcasting college sports at the University of Tampa, men's lacrosse, women's softball. So I put all that together, and there's also been some radio in my career, including some sports broadcasting besides UT, and had this calling really when I was on a business trip. Believe it or not. Well, you could believe it because in Luke's gospel, it says, "For nothing shall be impossible for God." So to be on a riverboat on a business trip in Brazil on the Amazon
Oh boy.
River, and right, and to all of a sudden hear this calling to serve the Lord, when you have a moment like that, you don't just brush it off.
Sure.
So I acted on that. The part of the story that I'm not telling is that in February of 2014, I started a podcast that I'm still doing to this day. So you figure by the time I had the idea for Catholic Sports Radio, I was already 5 years into that other podcast. So I
Wow.
thought, okay, I've always only been Catholic. I have all this sports background. I have all this podcasting knowledge at this point. Why not put them together and launch Catholic Sports Radio? And it's funny, William, because usually when people say, tell me what the show is about, or I just find myself telling people who've never heard about Catholic Sports Radio, I always start off by saying what it's not. I
Okay.
don't report scores or talk about wins and losses or statistics. I talk to Catholic guests who are current or former athletes, coaches, referees, umpires, clergy, administrators, whatever, about the intersection of their faith life and their sports life. And I really emphasize the Catholic part because when I started it up, I was maybe about a year into it and I started hearing, when are you going to get Tim Tebow on the show? And people would start throwing out all these names. And I would say, if they're not Catholic, they can't be on the show. And people
Sure.
would fight me on it and say, so if Tim Tebow is willing to do it, you wouldn't interview him? And I said, no, that's part of what makes Catholic Sports Radio unique. And I encourage somebody out there to start up Baptist Sports Radio and start up Lutheran Sports Radio and start up Methodist Sports Radio. It's a niche. But I also felt that unfortunately, the Catholic Church has lost a lot of people.
Like,
So if you understand the spirit with which I'm saying this, it would be unfortunate if it took listening to Catholic Sports Radio to get someone to go back to church. At the same time, I say if that happens, then thank you, God, for using me as the vehicle for what did move somebody to get back to going to church. Because I always say there's three primary audiences that I think of with Catholic Sports Radio, which is those people, the people who have completely fallen away and don't go to church. Number two is the people who go every Sunday, but they just go to check the box and they're not engaged at all. And number three is the people who are on fire for their faith. But, in the case of number one, maybe they do hear one or two or three episodes of Catholic Sports Radio and they say, I need to start going back to church. The second group of people, maybe they hear the podcast and they say, well, this Bruce guy, he's got me thinking, he's got me motivated, and I need to really start paying attention from now on Sundays and really dialing into the mass. And then the third group of people, they're already on fire for their faith. Maybe they join a ministry or another ministry at their church because they get fired up from hearing one or more interviews that I do.
sure. No, I mean, like I said, it's a great, great podcast to do. And like I said, going digging deep into the show, Bruce, just how do you? I'm just gonna throw out a question right now at you. Is would you like consider having, or maybe you have reached out to like Harrison Buckner to be on the show, or Justin Tucker? He's also, yeah, he's also Catholic. Also, where do you find, because there's a lot of different, well, like I said, a variety of people, coaches, players. Um, where do you find, are they more local, are they nationally? Who you have on the show?
That's a really good question for reasons of what the Lord has done to be able to let me do this show every week without missing once for what is almost 6 years now. Because
Wow.
when I initially conceptualized the show, I knew because of doing my other podcast that before you even launch episode one, you need to make a list of, as you're saying, who could I get as a guest, right? So in this
Uh,
case, they have to be Catholic and they have to be current or former athlete, coach, referee, umpire, clergy, administrator, whatever. So I made up that list, and boy, was my chest getting big because I thought, hey, look at me. I got 45, 46, 47, 48 names before I've even hit the record button on episode one. So I thought, yeah, I can do this. And then I took a step back and I said, well, wait a minute. I got to get a hold of all those people, and they all have to say yes. And in that case, I'm not even going to have a year's worth.
sure.
So what happened, William, was I started getting nervous and I started rethinking it. And I started to kind of take a step back or two, scratch my head. And I thought, well, maybe I don't have to do it every week then. And the more I thought about it, the more worried I was getting that what you're asking me was going to become a reality, that I'd find myself saying, where am I going to find guests? And when it got to the point where I felt myself really backing away, that's when I recognized the presence of Satan. And I
Mm,
said, he doesn't want me to do this at all. He doesn't want the Lord's name lifted up any more than it already is, not to mention outside of a Sunday. So then I got mad and I said, well, now I am going to do it. And it's as though in that moment, it's as though the Lord said, Bruce, you do the podcast and I'll get you the guests. And so now here we are, close to 6 years later, and I've released 310 episodes, never missed once. And I probably have 300 more names still on the list that started off as 45, 46, 47, 48 names. Because if you think of the Bible, when Jesus fed from fish and loaves more people than they had food, and the apostles kept saying, how are we going to sustain this? Right? That's what I was
right.
asking. How am I going to sustain this? I don't have enough to go around. I don't have enough guests to make this last. Jesus told them what to do. They put their faith and trust in him, and they had fish and loaves left over. And so in my case, I have leftovers in the sense that I still am able to keep going back to that list and finding people. So, there's a variety of sources that I use. My best source of guests is guests. When I finish an interview, I press the stop button, and the only question I ask the guest before I hang up with them is, if you know of anybody else that fits the criteria, please let me know. I'm always looking for more guests. And lots of guests have been happy to tell me, yeah, I've got some people in mind for you. I'll email you, I'll connect you, etc. So that's been a tremendous source.
Nice. Yeah, I mean, first of all, I applaud you for doing like 5 years for not missing a show because I am doing this is being my fourth year, and I think I miss probably like 4 shows a year. So I applaud you because that is
Thank
not
you.
easy to do.
Thank you.
Um, and plus you being a broadcaster, also a podcast, but mostly a broadcaster, you have probably a little bit more people that you can maybe reach out to who you're calling, because so and so is Catholic and he or she's playing at least at softball or lacrosse or whatever. So you probably have more people that way, but yeah,
Well, there's
it's
also a little trick that, and I got to give
sure.
her credit, that my wife employed. She
Okay,
tried to beta test some different word combinations for Google Alerts.
okay,
And so once she kind of found what the magic combination was, she set that, and now she gets emails and she will tell me, I found somebody that could potentially be a guest for you. And I'll tell her, just send it to my Bruce at CatholicSportsRadio.net email, and I'll find a way to get in touch with the person. Or sometimes she'll put an asterisk and say, I'm pretty sure this person's Catholic, but you need to check it first. So even those Google alerts that she has set up has been a nice resource, because it is, when you mention some NFL player, some Major League Baseball player, whoever it is, all of a sudden something will show up somewhere online, and that's how we catch those. And all of a sudden I am able to add to that list. And when they're playing for a team, then it's as easy as just contacting that team and say, I want to arrange an interview with John Doe. Now, granted, it doesn't mean
sure.
they're always going to say yes, because full disclosure, my list might be 600 people, But that not only includes the 310 I've done so far, but it also includes the people who have said no.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is that I can do that. I can exhale instead of panicking and getting nervous and saying, oh my gosh, there's an episode due out Monday and it's Wednesday and I don't have anybody for that one.
Right. No, that is very cool. So very, really nice of your wife to do that. So I mean, have someone looking out for you like that. So
Yeah, for
awesome.
sure.
So I want to keep it going. Again, I apologize and I'll keep going. But what are some of your favorite, people calling you, people writing to you, people stopping you on the street and saying, "Man, I love this particular episode because of so and so and so." What have been your favorite feedback thus far on? Again, you got two podcasts, but on Catholic Sports Radio.
Yeah, with Catholic Sports Radio, the mere fact that I do get emails from listeners, the fact that I do get replies on Twitter, the fact that I do get people who donate to my ministry and attach a note, and I call it a ministry because this is just me giving back with my time and talent, like we always hear at Mass on Sunday. I don't get
Right.
any income for doing it. It's not my part-time job. It's not my full-time job. So when people make a donation and they attach a nice note to it, that really touches my heart. All that encouragement really keeps me going because when it is something that you're doing, let's say voluntarily, it's easy to talk yourself out of it. This is taking up too much time, or I'm too tired, or I can't find a guest, or whatever excuse you can make. And sometimes, and of course, we know it's Satan whispering in your
Right.
ear. Well, there's really nobody listening. Nobody really cares about what you're doing. And so when you start getting down on yourself, and what I've done, William, is I've taken to where I start printing out some of those emails. I start printing out some of those notes that are attached to donations so that when I am having a down day, I can look at those and read those and say, there are people that care. When you do it every week for what's about to be 6 years without missing once, and there's zero paycheck in it, all that feedback from listeners tells you that the time and the work that you're doing, it is touching people. And so if it's a note that's one sentence or if it's one paragraph, I really don't know that the audience can appreciate. You can because you do it as well behind the microphone, but how
Right.
much that really means and how much encouragement. And I think it's really also indirectly their way of expressing support. They believe in this concept of the mix of faith and sports because it gets lonely. Even though you and we interview people, you're still just sitting in a room by yourself. We don't have
Right.
this live audience in front of us. And so when you get those emails from people, the support just means so much. That feedback is kind of, I can see the Lord moving in my ministry. So I don't need anything other than that.
Sure.
But yet, if you understand the spirit with which I'm saying this, the validation from those audience members that give you that feedback, that's the icing on the cake.
No, I know what you mean 100% because it's every so often, I mean, you feel like, okay, is this worth it? Am I maybe even doing God's work right now? What am I doing? And usually, when that happens, Bruce, someone stops me after Mass and they're like, hey, you're the Catholic Table Talk guy, right? I'm like,
Mm,
yeah. I'm like, thank you so much for doing that. I love listening to it. Or, they're helping me out, trying to promote my show and come up with events, opportunities to help me out. And it's like they're kind of going out of their way to help me, and it's like, and then it's like you said, it's then it's okay. That's Satan saying, okay, maybe stop or slow down or whatever. Don't promote it as much, and you can see God working through you and your show. So I 100% agree with you.
yeah, I
So
looked at, for some reason, I randomly looked at the Catholic Sports Radio YouTube channel. Now, Catholic Sports Radio is an audio only podcast.
okay,
However, because there's such value in being on YouTube, because it has become, and it's still difficult for me to say this, but the fact that YouTube has become the biggest podcast consumption platform, you need to be there. So,
right,
fortunately, and we don't need to, for your audience, we don't need to get into the technology that makes this possible, but you can, quote unquote, listen to Catholic Sports Radio on YouTube in the sense that if you go there to watch, all you're going to see is just the guest's picture throughout the entire video. But what I'm getting at is I had on a priest. He had just been ordained 48 hours before we recorded our interview, and he's based in France. So this was in the lead up to the 2024 Paris Olympics.
Okay.
And I looked at YouTube. Now, I'm also going to be fully transparent and say I do not get big numbers on YouTube. And again, it probably has a lot to do with the fact that it's just audio. But the fact that this priest who's in France has far more views on his episode than some of the other people. I've had Mark Wahlberg on my podcast. I've had Mario Lopez. I've had Lou Holtz. I've had Mario Andretti. And when you see this priest who gets all these views, it really makes you stop in your tracks as the host and say, thank you, God, because I'm amazed that that many people are paying attention to this Bruce guy in Florida who's interviewing this newly ordained priest in France.
Sure. Yeah. No kidding. Wow, 48 hours before. That's
Yeah.
not long.
Yeah.
Wow.
But he had a nice story in terms of they were doing something called the Holy Games. So
Okay.
obviously, as I said, he had to have a connection to sports. He had been a world champion himself in, I think it was Taekwondo. So there was also, some actual practical athletic background that he had. But yeah, it was so nice to see the reception to that and the timing, talk about divine appointment. The fact that he had just been ordained a priest 48 hours earlier was really special for both he and I.
Sure. Yeah. Well, quickly, Bruce, I don't know if you know off the top of your head, what episode was that?
I can look it up, but I can tell you his name is Father Jason Nioka,
Okay.
Nioka.
I'll put it
And
down.
as I said, it was last summer because the Olympic Games were happening, and so it was very timely, for he and I to have that conversation as his project, as the Holy Games was being rolled out, and to have to ask him before I hit the record button, oh, by the way, do I call you Father? Are you Jason? What do you want to be referred to as? And there it was that he had just been ordained. It's episode 283. It came out on
Okay.
on July 1st.
Okay. I'll put it down in the show notes, since you mentioned the episode, and I'll put it down in the show notes for a quicker
Thank you.
link for the audience members. So, this next question, Bruce, is really, I think it hits a lot of people, and this is, again, this connection between the faith and sports, and pretty much the top reason I have you on right today, and it's really personal to me as well, but I think it's a lot personal to a lot of the arts members, is when you love sports, or a sport, as much as I do, like I say, I absolutely love the Minnesota Vikings. You could probably, my family would talk to you for hours of how much I love the Minnesota Vikings on Sundays. And I have all kinds of, like I said, Vikings merch. But I will say this is when I go to buy, let's say, a Sacred Heart of Jesus flag, or I look at, or a flag of, Mary, or a flag of maybe a favorite saint, or any more faith-related flag in terms of going to a local hardware, not hardware store, but a local retail store and looking at Vikings flags, I'm much more adapt to buy a Vikings flag than I do, um, a faith flag. So
Yep.
how do you why is sports so hard to put second, and put God first? Why is it so hard? I mean, again, it's earthly. Satan's probably, behind it. But what really gives sports that grip on you more than pretty much anything else?
Well, sports is an escape from the daily grind.
Sure.
It's something that helps take the mind off of work or financial problems or relationship challenges. It's an outlet to relieve stress. Plus, there are so many ways to be active with sports, whether as a player or as a coach or as a referee or as a fan. Think about this, there are always sports on TV, whereas too many people think of church as once a week.
Hmm. Yeah.
So it's always sports on TV, and the thinking is that God, oh, that's church once a week. If you have a son or a daughter that plays sports, you go all out to root for and support them, and you get caught up in, especially when you see the money that pro athletes are being paid.
Sure.
And now that NIL deals are very much a reality with college athletes, now it's okay, little Jimmy or little Jane, we got to push him, we got to push her. The potential for them to really make some money, just like you train for sports, you need to train your brain that your faith has to have top importance. Sadly, to your question about buying a Vikings flag before a, a, a religious flag, people will talk about sports with you a lot faster than they will about faith.
Right. And I mean, they probably know more about sports than they do the faith, probably too. I mean, most
Yeah.
a lot could be as well.
Yeah.
And yeah, so like I
Think
said,
about that
that's
expression. They always say there's two things that you shouldn't talk about is religion and politics. Well, if we can't talk about religion or if we're not supposed to talk about religion, how are we supposed to evangelize? How are we supposed to be proud of our faith?
right.
And I get it. I get it. There's so many sports talk shows. Of course, people want to talk about sports and you hear about sports bars, right? You don't hear about faith bars.
No,
But, the fact of the matter is, people are trying to dictate to us, no, 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 don't come in here with religion. Don't talk to me about that. Don't talk to me about politics. Well, that's where I always say, and a lot of times on Catholic sports radio, I will challenge the audience to be bold in their faith. And I'll say, you don't all have to host a podcast. You don't all have to stand on the street corner and evangelize. However, one of the pillars of my ministry is that sports are great and it's okay to want to strive to be a pro athlete and get the big contract. And there are wonderful benefits to sport, like good sportsmanship and physical fitness and teamwork. However, we don't worship sport. We worship God and God alone. And I think that's kind of the perspective that we need to have. And this idea that church is once a week, no, it's every day in everything you do.
right.
There's the abbot at the abbey where I'm a Benedictine oblate. He always says, and your audience may be surprised to hear this, he doesn't like hearing people say, let us pray. Because he
Really?
says, why are you stopping yourself to pray? You should be in a constant state of prayer. So if you're having to say, let us pray, that means, oh, I'm doing so many other things I'm not used to. I'm having to go out of my way to get into a mode of prayer. My spiritual director told me years ago, he said, Bruce, I really want to encourage you to always have a rosary in your pocket. And so I do. I just took this out of my pocket right now. And it's the same with the abbot. He says, if you see me plunge my hand into my pocket, it's because I'm grabbing my crucifix so that I can be praying as I'm talking to somebody. So these are the kind of things, people think, well, I got to go to my son's soccer game. Okay, so pray with your son in the car on the way there. Pray for the coaches, pray for the athletes, pray for the officials when you're sitting in the stands. You don't have to leave at mass on Sunday and that's it. And hopefully people go to daily mass, or maybe they go 1 or 2 days during the week. But there's no reason why you can't mix faith and sports together. So that's a large part of what my ministry is about, is having these guests come on and give the audience real world practical examples of faith and sports. A lot of guests will talk about, oh, when I was in college, I played on such and such a sports team and we had a team Bible study. Well, there you go. And they'll say we would meet on Friday nights at 6 o'clock. Well, guess what? That sounds like a pretty unusual time to be talking about sports and about faith, and praise God that that it wasn't, we would go to mass together as a team on Sunday. Well, duh, of course, that's the easy one. So something as simple as that. There was a girl who was a pro softball player, and she said, in the dugout, every game before every at bat, I would just quietly pray Hail Mary. There was a world champion boxer. He told me, he said, I would put a scapular in my boots and I would go into my opponent's dressing room before every match to pray with him. So if you say, how are people mixing faith and sports, that doesn't sound realistic. There's some wonderful examples right there.
Right. No, there is. And I mean, I played baseball for most of my life and, well, through high school. And I remember I didn't play that much on the field like I probably should have. I do remember being on the mound and playing before I eating or whatever. Um, and like you said, I mean, yeah, you have that. It's much more of that. Going to pro sports, you have that. Okay, he makes money. It's that greed. It's that anything else than God. And like you said, I mean, a lot of people probably know more about sports than God, and they only go to church once a week. And I love your point where it's like sports is like you're running along constantly, when church is like, we go there once a week for 1 hour, and then we blow out a town. So I love your answer to that question. So
Thank you.
so I know you, to that point as well. When do you think this all kind of started happening with sports? I mean, sports hasn't been around forever, and we knew. I mean, ever since TV started, sports have gotten big. Of course, the radio had. I mean, that was a big invention back in its day, and still is. But when do you think this really changed people's minds of doing more sports or doing sports instead of God? Like you said, a lot of them is like becoming pro, but not a lot of people become pro. So when did this happen?
I think that once ESPN also had ESPN2, and then later they had ESPNU, and then they
For
had
sure.
ESPN3. Then what we saw was fantasy sports got a strong foothold, fantasy football, fantasy insert sport here. Then sports betting really took off. And then the biggest explosion out of all of that was the adaptation of streaming video on smartphones. Now it became a whole new shift in mindset. Money's on the line. You seek refuge in that instead of in prayer. So people start having financial problems. And instead of going to prayer, they say, well, if I can bet on some games, I can win some good money. You could also lose a lot of money.
Right.
You put your faith and trust in God. You bring those challenges to Him. You bring your thanks and praise to Him. But because it's so accessible, there's so much sports content everywhere. Now I know that, yes, I'm going to say it. Thanks to people like you and I, William, there's a lot more. I'm even going to just say spiritual content, not necessarily Catholic, not necessarily Christian, because yes, there are podcasts like mine and like yours, and there's EWTN, and there's one after another of websites and podcasts and YouTube channels, you name it. However, as we talked about earlier, what do you think people are more conditioned to sit down at their computer and go look for? Probably sports content, unfortunately, not for something. I just recorded an interview for my podcast where the guest was talking about a reversion to his faith. And you can see the Lord's hand in the witness that these guests share on my show. He sat down at a time when there weren't really smartphones and the things that we're talking about right now. And there was a stack of books on the desk. And the one book that he grabbed was a Dynamic Catholic Matthew Kelly book.
Okay.
So it's unfortunate that it's those rare instances, but I think you have to avail yourself to the Holy Spirit to let the Holy Spirit move you in that direction so that you do go looking for Catholic content, or you do go looking for praying the rosary instead of I'm going to put on one more episode of insert Netflix series here. It's a conscious decision. We have a choice, and it's become more difficult to make because of all those things that I just listed, all the different
Right.
ESPN outlets and fantasy sports and sports betting and smartphones. But I think that if you avail yourself to the Holy Spirit in the way that you and I have, you can hear the call to say, well, maybe I need to serve the church somehow. And now you're taking that time away from Do you really need to be watching, that Oakland A's, um, you know, Los Angeles Angels game on a Tuesday night in June? Come on, go to the men's group at church, hang out with those guys. They'll probably be talking sports anyways.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, great answer. I mean, plus right now the A's and the Angels are not too good anyway when we're talking. So I mean that makes a lot of sense. Easy. But yeah. Um. So kind of last question for the show, Bruce, and then we'll kind of dive into again last remarks on your show and stuff like that and contact. But again, kind of more a personal question. But should and can Catholics have man caves for sports? I mean, again, like you said, I mean, it's sports bars. It's not, Catholic bars. It's, you might have a prayer room, or you might have a man cave. Can Catholics have a man cave?
Yes, the short
Okay.
answer is yes. I don't want your audience to misunderstand what you and I've talked about to mean that you should consider never watching sports again and going into the seminary. That's
Right.
that's a little far-fetched. That said, though, if your man cave is where you have to escape your wife, it's so heartbreaking when you hear guys say, that's where I go to escape the wife, to get away from her for a while. If your man cave does become a quote unquote shrine that affects your family life and your faith life, well, okay, then now it's gone too far. So
Sure.
no, it's perfectly fine for a Catholic to have a man cave, but again, it's keeping that perspective. Just like I said before, that sports are great. There's a lot of wonderful benefit to sport, but we worship God and God alone. We don't worship sport. You don't do that man cave as this is my space, honey. This is where I go to get away from you. And you go in there and you look, let's see, I have 72 bobbleheads. I think I'm going to challenge myself to get up to 100. No, that's now it's becoming a little bit more than what it was supposed to be, which is it's
Sure.
supposed to be I enjoy sports. I want to go in there. I want to watch my teams, and of course, hang up some memorabilia for, like you said, for the Vikings, for the Twins, for the Wild. But when it's so out of control, so here's something that I thought of in preparation for coming on your show.
Sure.
If you get to the point, and you'll see where the man cave fits in here. If you get to the point where you say, Mass on Sunday. I'm not going to Mass on Sunday. The Vikings are playing in the London game, so I've got to be in front of the television in the morning because it's morning time here in Minnesota when the game comes on. Now you're starting to see where, okay, you've crossed a line. Now all of a sudden you have made sports your number one priority. If it's a holy day of obligation, it falls on a Wednesday night, and you say, well, I can't go to Mass that night. Jimmy's got a baseball game that night. Well,
Mm.
guess what? Jimmy's got lots of other baseball games, but it's a holiday of obligation. And Jimmy's still going to probably play. Now, granted, that's a whole nother conversation about your child and showing them the right example. But I think the audience is understanding here my point that when sports is a priority and nothing can come before that, and you have to be in front of the TV for this, or I think, unfortunately, about Super Bowl Sunday
Oh,
when
sure.
some people just become a raging lunatic because they've got so much money on it or because their team is playing in the Super Bowl. This same person who a few hours earlier sat there in church and acted like a good Christian and maintained their composure, and now a few hours later is this totally different person at home that unfortunately resorts to domestic violence and is hitting their wife because they're so upset because their team is losing or they're about to lose their bet. That's when sports has gone way too far in terms of being the priority instead of following your faith.
Well said. I really love that answer. Yeah, make your man cave or your sports cave. It doesn't have to be a man cave. I mean, open it up to your family, like you said. Open it up to your wife. Open it up to your family. Open it up to friends, and that's where gather and you can talk about other things. Like you can talk about the faith too in the man cave. But yeah, it's when you start to get into domestic violence, then just violence in front of your kids, and it doesn't have to be domestic. Just be breaking something or going a little too far on that as
Yeah,
well.
yeah.
That's I definitely like that point too. Yeah, you can laugh together in any minute games. You can cry together. You can probably scream together at a bad play that your team does or whatever. But make that together and not just one or taking that out on someone. So I really like that point there, Bruce. Um, so that we reached the end of the show, Bruce. I know you have to get going, so real quick, can you please let us know how people can get in contact with you, and also where to listen to your show more?
Yeah, and I just wanted to share one or two quick closing remarks that come to mind based on that last conversation that we just had, that last
Sure.
topic that we covered. Mike Candrea, I think this was episode 4. So when I
Okay.
first launched the show, longtime Arizona softball coach, and he coached the women's Olympic softball team to the gold medal in 2004 in Athens, Greece. He was a guest on my show, and he said, "What kind of message are we sending to our kids when we're telling them out of one side of our mouth, you need to go to mass on Sunday, and out of the other side of our mouth, as coaches, we're telling them we got a tournament this weekend and we're scheduling a
Mm.
game for 10 o'clock Sunday morning." So he was pretty bold there in making that statement and recognizing we have a problem
Mhm.
when we're scheduling games in direct conflict with when we should be going to mass. This is not good. Another gem, and I think this possibly might have been episode 10. Neil Pionk, he plays currently for the Winnipeg Jets. At the time, he
Okay.
played for the New York Rangers. He's a defenseman. And I'm going to paraphrase what he said, but he said, if we're lucky, we play in the NHL maybe 10 years, say into our age 30s. And to paraphrase him, he basically said, we'll have our NHL career for 10 years. We have our faith for our entire life. Which do you think is more important? So that was really powerful. And then in closing, just for your audience, because I had mentioned some of the sexy names before, like Mark Wahlberg and Mario Lopez and Lou Holtz and Mario Andretti, I think it's easy to get caught up in what episode number was that? I want to go listen to that one. And
Sure.
yes, by all means, please do it. And I'm going to tell you in a minute how you can find the show. But I always think of Julia Webb. Julia Webb is the assistant track and field and cross country coach at Ave Maria University, an hour or
Okay.
so south of me here in Florida. And I have to say all that because if I just say Julia Webb, your audience is going to go, "Who's that?" You know who those other people are that I just named, but you don't know who she is. And sometimes, William, I think people like Julia Webb resonate with the audience more so than Mark Wahlberg, more so than Mario Lopez, more so than Lou Holtz, more so than Mario Andretti, because it's as though the person who lives next door to you is talking to Bruce Wawrzyniak on Catholic Sports Radio. It's as though somebody who you see at Mass on Sunday is talking to Bruce Wawrzyniak on Catholic Sports Radio. Here's Julia, who's married, has children, has this coaching position, and yet is living a wonderful life of faith and sports, and gave some great testimony, by the way, on that episode. So I usually tell people you don't have to be Catholic to listen to Catholic Sports Radio. It's not like you're not going to understand what we're talking about. You don't have to be involved in sports or a sports fan. It might just be the testimony and the stories that people are sharing. But I think in that case, it's I can relate to this person because she sounds like somebody I'd bump into at the supermarket. So,
Right.
yes. So, in closing, you can go to CatholicSportsRadio.net. Believe it or not, you can actually go to CatholicSportsRadio.com. They'll both get you to the same website.
Okay.
CatholicSportsRadio.net or CatholicSportsRadio.com. I've got a few logos at the top for the usual places like Apple Podcasts, like Spotify, like iHeartRadio. I mentioned YouTube before. There's another page on the website that has a long, long, long list of the many platforms that carry it. I usually like to say you can find Catholic Sports Radio almost anywhere that you listen to podcasts.
Yeah. Good point. That's a good point. Again, Bruce, thank you for your witness. Thank you for your time tonight. And just a little touch base, a little bit on the last part you just shared with us as well. Like I think just listening to Mark Wahlberg, yes, his story kind of back to the faith is inspirational, but like you said, listening to Julia can be more profitable, if that's the right word to use. for maybe you or a family member that you know, because I mean, when you Google Mark Wahlberg, and nothing against Mark Wahlberg, if you're listening, Mark, but you probably hear the same story a few times, and you might hear something identical to it, where again, you might find more interesting, not interesting, more, like I said, it touches home more for you, like I said, the person next door, the unfamous person that has a great story to share too. And again, thank you for your time, Bruce, and thank you for what you do at Catholic Sports Radio.
My pleasure. My pleasure. God bless you, William. Thank you for having me on.
Yeah, anytime, and you're more than welcome to come on the show again. I really enjoy the time, so reach out. I might be reaching out later, and we'll get you back on if you're willing.
Thank you so much.
All right, that's Bruce Wawrzyniak, everyone. Check them out, CatholicSportsRadio.com or .net. We'll have the links and the shows, episodes that he listed down below in the show notes, so it's quick access. We'll see you next week. Stay in, stay graced. You do that by going to the sacraments, not going to sporting events. All right, take care, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode of the Catholic Table Talk Podcast, where everything Catholic is on the table. Don't forget to subscribe to Catholic Table Talk on your favorite podcast platform to get new episodes delivered directly to you every Thursday at 9 a.m. Eastern.